Thank you. It's great to be here. I thought I'd start with a little light take on the state of the industry. This is actually, everyone's heard about the Wanamaker line about not knowing which half of their advertising is wasted. I think these days the question is, how long are both the agencies and advertisers going to wait until they use the data to actually measure the effectiveness? So it was kind of a funny take. The fact is, the data is available today. Now, granted, it's not available at scale. I mean, each operator is different in terms of what they have. But the fact is, all of the operators, especially in the States, are working aggressively to onboard the data. And I really think the focus is on driving the measurement and effectiveness of those ad investments. This was something that was interesting out of Deloitte, which basically surveyed consumers to determine what are the most influential platforms or means when it comes to purchase decisions. What's interesting, other than recommendations from friends and family, television was the single most important influencer on purchase decisions. I think we've known this in our gut. Clearly, there's billions of dollars traded in this space based on the fact that ultimately it's driving business results. The problem is there hasn't been a method to measure it on a real granular basis, and that's really what we're focused on right now. And I mentioned last year we went to full census level data capture, meaning in our footprint of a little under 3 million households, we've got about little north of 7 million set-top boxes that are capturing data on a second-by-second basis. And then through third parties, we're able to append that data to give it much more dimension, whether it's a programmer trying to understand how to tell the difference between loyal and casual viewers, or an automotive client that's really trying to understand how many in-market buyers are in the footprint. When we first started with the data, the first thing we learned was that there's just a ton of viewing and a lot of impressions that aren't measured. The top 40 networks are relatively accurate using a panel. In the case of the United States, Nielsen is kind of the currency. It's a small panel. There's about 116 million television viewing households and about 25,000 people meters to measure them. So clearly just that math alone creates problems. It doesn't necessarily play out so much on the top 40 networks, but in our case, we've got hundreds of networks on our dial. And anything 40 plus generally is going to either be under measured or not measured. There'll be zero cell. So what this white space means is, for us, it's a lot of impressions that haven't been monetized because they haven't been measured. For advertisers, it's a lot of audiences that they haven't been reaching, since typically they'll focus on the top 20 or top 30 networks. And in some cases, I think I mentioned last year, the case of Porsche, which was a client that we did a lot of data work with, a majority of the audiences they were trying to reach could only be found in this white space. So only until we had the data to measure were we able to kind of unlock that for them. And in this case, we were able to get CPMs on inventory that we never could have in the past. I think one of the other important parts about data is, obviously there's a wealth of data in the marketplace. The real question is, how do you package it up to deliver insights and value? And in our case, we really have created these tight bundles or portfolios of products that address very specific needs. So if you just think of the campaign, any campaign life cycle, you have the planning phase on the front end. Audience discovery, because there is much more granular data available, we spend a lot of time working with clients and agencies to understand exactly what are the attributes of the households that client is trying to get to. And ironically, on the television side of the house, since everyone's been working in the world of age and gender, generally they'll use those as a proxy for, say, households that might be relevant for a sports utility vehicle. But when you get to the CRM and the database marketing folks within a client, they're the ones that really understand on a granular basis what are those attributes. So the more embedded on the client side that we can get to understand what those audience definitions are and then map that back to our data, generally that's what I would consider to be a best use case for this. And then in addition to just the standard attributes, because we have all the viewing data, we can do things like a viewability index, or instead of doing look-alike modeling, we can do view-alike modeling. So here are attributes of a consumer you're trying to reach. here are others that share very similar tastes and preferences when it comes to television viewing that can actually add more dimension to it. So we can use our own audience data. And then when we get to targeting, it's really just taking those audience profiles and definitions and attributes and appending it to our viewing data so that we can understand not only just at one point in time or over a period of time how the networks and day parts index against that audience, but also how that may change on a day-to-day basis, since viewing is very volatile on a day-to-day basis. So even though you may have a sense of which networks and day parts index high over the course of a month, each day it changes. So our ability to take a look at that, look at how the impressions are delivering and then optimizing on a daily basis is something that's also relatively new with television. And then finally, the measurement on the back end. Initially it was really just reporting targeted impressions for clients, and now much more it's linking those ad exposures to some KPI, whether it's traffic to the website, it could be coupon redemption, or ultimately sales. And the sales data is obviously nirvana, just because we can actually go the next step and do an ROI analysis on the campaign. So what I want to do is just kind of give you a real live example of this. This is an automotive campaign.
May I please have a moment of privacy to speak with my roommate?
3 different segments, so they basically just took the single avail, divided it up into 3 segments. So in 3
music,
different
an act
households,
that appeals to
basically
different
there are
audiences
3
is
different
called a crossover.
product ads
And though crossover
that will run, an
vehicles can't carry
SUV,
a tune,
a minivan,
Dodge
and a
Journey
truck.
can carry.
And then in terms of the reporting that we got out of that campaign, on the left is like the old world, which is here's how many spots we ran, here's the GRP, and here's the price, right? With no correlation to how many of those households were actually relevant or those GRPs were relevant. On the right is an example of a reporting package that we deliver, standard reporting package in most cases, where we can actually show target impressions by network. So for each of those segments, truck, SUV, minivan, we show how the impressions delivered on a network by network basis. On the right, we can look at it, target impressions by segment. So how did the campaign deliver in aggregate, and then what proportion of those impressions were delivered across each of those segments. And then more often than not these days, we're doing a lot of linear versus non-linear viewing. What percentage of those impressions were delivered in a non-linear environment, DVR or VOD. The good news there is that the nonlinear consumption is still rather small, but what's interesting is depending on the audience attributes, the target clients or customers that a particular advertiser is trying to go after, in some cases it over-indexes on DVR. So just knowing the composition of viewing and what percentage of that is live versus non-live or nonlinear can be insightful. And then on the right, which is a sales conversion analysis, I'll blow that up just so you can get a sense of how we do this. In this case, we took 2 segments, SUV and minivan, and among those households that were deemed in market for those respective categories of vehicle, we compared the conversion rate among exposed versus non-exposed households. So everything else being equal, households that were in market for a particular, in this case, SUV, converted at a 32% higher rate. In the case of the minivan, it was a 48% lift. And even though these numbers, like in terms of total sales, don't seem significant over the course of a flight, when you consider the average, vehicles, $30,000 to $50,000 US, that actually adds up to a significant amount of money. So in essence, in this case, the campaign paid for itself 5 or 6 times over again in aggregate. And then when you break it down by segment, you can see each segment had significant lift, and that's very common. In some cases, we see 200-300% lift, depending on the attribute. So everything I just showed you is what we would consider to be kind of our bundled package or our bundled offering of data with a media campaign. What we've done since that time is develop a whole suite of services for clients that may or may not even want to run advertising, but that really want to get deep audience analytics. In the early days, it was a lot of programmers, and now we're starting to work with brands that really want to understand things. Like, a good example would be, we work with MSG, big venue, the Madison Square Garden in New York, and by matching ticket sales for certain sporting events and concerts against viewing data, they're able to get much more dimension on audiences that may be, say, a Knicks fan or maybe a Billy Joel fan who may not have purchased tickets, but can use the viewing attributes to kind of expand their target audience definition. So that's what we consider kind of a custom analytics project. And the analytics projects vary based on whether we're really getting granular on the audience, the programming. It could also be something really specific to optimized media planning, or Jean-Paul mentioned this before about creative testing. We do this a lot where we'll take two different pieces of ad copy and then measure the effect of each of those. And then ultimately conversion analytics. And then custom analytics is an area where these days we're matching up, say, with a programmer that has a lot of digital consumption data for their content on Roku, on PlayStation, and on connected TV. They have a lot of that session data, but they have no idea, based on that consumption, how those viewers are consuming in a conventional way on TV. So a lot of the custom work we do now is to basically match up those two records so that we could get a holistic view of how particular audiences are consuming. And is a lot of the digital eroding linear, or is it additive? We spend a lot of time working on that. I won't bore you with a lot of the detail other than to say whether it's digging deep in the audience attributes and understanding kind of how audiences are moving, to a show. We do source and destination. So aside from just what's the audience composition of someone tuning in for a particular show, what are the shows that drive most of that audience to the network? So we do rankers based on that. And then after that show ends, what are the most popular destination? On the web, it's just path analysis. Here we call it source and destination, very similar method. We also do network and program optimization, which is taking a conventional linear schedule that a client might be running, and then based on the unique audience attributes, scoring the relevance of that linear schedule. In other words, how impactful are their dollars today, and then comparing that against a more optimized schedule. Ad copy effectiveness, and then a lot of work on the programming side. What's interesting about having this second-by-second data is we can not only identify periods of the show where audiences are drifting away, but we can also track where those unique audiences are going. So if a programmer has a certain premiere and they're finding that at a certain point in the show, there's a lot of drift away from that network, we can understand whether it's a show contention issue. Is there another show in that time block that's kind of competing? And then what are the attributes of those audiences that are moving away? Is it really the target audience or is it not? And then based on that information, they can then either move time slots or they can run tune-in spots on other networks where those audiences are to kind of get them back. And then just like in the auto example, doing what we call tune-in conversion, which is taking our single largest category of advertiser or programmers that are running, or broadcasters that are running a lot of promotion to drive tune-in. So to be able to kind of correlate every ad exposure that they're running and the effect or the conversion rate of that exposure to the actual show is hugely valuable, because right now it's literally, they're just blasting spots out and then looking at the aggregate rating to see if their dollars paid off. In this case, they can actually track conversion rate down to the network that those spots aired at, and then the day part. Conventional wisdom for a primetime show is you should be promoting it in primetime. That's actually not the case. You can see in a couple of cases here, History and USA, that red portion of the bar down below represents daytime. You could see in those particular examples, daytime actually drove a higher conversion rate than even primetime. And those daytime rates are a lot lower. So being able to optimize tune-in conversion is another big part of what we do. Reassembling total consumption, both live and non-live. In this case, we took a particular episode that generated 80,000 viewers, and then over a 7-day period, we broke down what the consumption was on a time-shifted basis, same day, next day, day 3, 4 to 7, and then VOD. What blew us away here was just the amount of consumption on VOD. I mean, that was significant, and I think it had a lot to do with the fact that it was a younger demo. And what we found is this Netflix effect is actually having positive benefits in the sense that it's driving a lot of binge viewing on VOD. So the sessions and the session duration on VODs are much longer now because you've got this behavior of people binge viewing or catching up on seasons, and you could certainly see this play out in the case of the VOD example. Here's another example of how conventional measurement does not work. If you looked at just the top line, episode 1 and 2 of a show, the programmers and the marketers would be high-fiving. Between episode 1 and 2, we maintained our audience, 79,000. What they didn't realize until we delved into it was that the majority of those audiences churned out. You could see only 21,000 of the 79,000 were actually audiences that tuned into episode 1. 56,000, the majority of the audience in episode 2 were actually new viewers. So understanding the amount of churn and what's driving that churn is really important, because what could happen in a situation like this is all of a sudden ratings just drop and they have no idea, because Nielsen's reporting that it's actually pulling a good rating. So this is the kind of stuff that again, with having granular data and the ability to kind of identify it at a household level, allows you to do stuff that you couldn't normally do. So I always have to throw an eye chart up here just to kind of blow you away with all the data. The fact is, there's a lot of it, and I think so much of what we try to do is put it in a form that's usable and readable. And this dashboard, it's kind of like a heart monitor for a network, is customizable based on whatever attributes a programmer wants. So in the case of AMC, they wanted to look at very specific things relating to the network overall. Then they wanted to delve into a section of shows that they were tracking, and then the audience composition. And it's a standard dashboard that we create. So while in the past we would do a lot of custom reports and kind of send them over the fence and have them digest it, now much more of what we're doing is providing almost real-time stats to the programmer based on what unique aspects of the program they want to watch. And I think it's also an example of kind of what can be done with the data that you wouldn't be able to do with conventional measurement. We announced TAP last year. I'm pleased to announce, as of this morning, we just announced with Modi that we are out of trial mode and that we've partnered with them on a long-term basis, whereby we're going to be providing full access to the data as well as our technology in exchange for a pretty significant addressable commitment over a long period of time. And I think it's a real testament to just the state of the industry that we're kind of out of trial mode, and we're getting ready for prime time. And I think based on what I see happening in Europe now with addressable really rolling out and the fact that data now is starting to be collected, I think in another year or two, we're going to be kind of matched in terms of the capabilities that exist in the States and over here. And we're more than happy to extend access to TAP to any distributor that's interested in using it, because it's really been a great tool for us, not only on the sell side to be able to represent sales on a more advanced basis, but also on the buy side. So I'm going to finish with this teaser video. I think it's in here.
Finally, the precision of online media planning is here for those who advertise on the flat screen, flat panel, or old school tube TV. It's Cablevision's total audience application. And whether you're a Mega Million multi-client, a big agency media planner, or the Happy Camper Corner pizza store chain, it's for you. The Total Audience app walks you through the steps. Pick a plan. Home in on your target. Gender, education, kids, ethnicity, do they travel, invest, take cruises, own a car, where do they live, what do they earn? Hundreds of search criteria. Millions of possible target permutations, allowing advertisers to target the people they most want to reach, the people most likely to buy their goods or services, and minimize wasted impressions. Some call it programmatic. We call it Cablevision's Total Audience app. Easy, efficient, innovative. Seriously, why didn't someone think of this before?
Boom. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Brilliant.
My pleasure.
A question from the room. Anyone? Yeah, there's one in the back over there. Do we absolutely need to wait for the microphone, or can he ask the question? Okay. That's okay, the mic is coming. There you go. If you can say who you are, maybe?
Yeah, sure. My name is Martin. I'm from Portugal, from a free-to-air television company. I was just wondering, listening to you, to you guys, how do you have access to the data on the set-top boxes? Because in Portugal, for example, they don't belong to the broadcasters. They belong to different companies that that just deliver the content. and we don't have any access to those set-top boxes data.
I think that's the inherent issue, and that's why our first step was to capture all of the data to make sure that it's kind of full census level. And there were years where we were just using the data for our own purposes, looking at channel positions and looking at networks that we could add and so forth. We got started about 6 years ago, and for the first 3 years, it was literally just used internally. And then since that time, we've externalized the data, and that's where I think you're going, which is being able to productize and synthesize the data so that instead of just sending raw log files, because I think that's one of the big misnomers, everyone in the industry is like, well, just send us your data. And the fact is there's a tremendous amount of work that needs to go through to normalize the data and then synthesize it. So when I talk about making our data available, we're making it available as kind of a data as a service model, which is we'll provide a feed through, say, a TAP tool or other reporting dashboards. And that's not only for advertisers, but for broadcasters. I think the issue is that most of the distributors around the world are where we were a few years ago, where they're just starting or they're kind of midway through their collection process. And I think there's a feeling that until they get the full census of the data collected, all of the data collected and normalized, I think there's a sense that they can only make it available at that point, and they're not there yet. I think there are certain, we work closely with Liberty, and we know that they're very aggressively focused on this, not only on the collection, but also on the externalization of the data, making it available. Because ultimately, programmers and advertisers have been disintermediated from that data, and it's literally like selling a product in a store and having no information about store sales. Yeah, you might get aggregate sales, but you don't understand, depending on the shelf that you place a product, how that can affect sales. And I think over time that'll become much more accessible. We're just, a few years ahead of the rest, I think.
Because the data is yours, right? The set-top boxes are yours.
Right. In
So
our
you
case,
own the data.
right. It's first party. It's our own data. But our goal isn't to keep it just to ourselves. To make it available.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
As I